Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases in history. Today, we'll explore the dark mountains of Kentucky, where the Appalachian peaks hide secrets that time won't let go of. If you're joining us, please tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Let's find out what happened in those far-off places together. This video is a work of fiction made just for fun. Any resemblance to real people, living or dead, is completely coincidental. It was the year 1916. The world was in chaos, and even in the most remote parts of the United States, the news of war spread through late newspapers and travelers' stories. But in the mountains of Kentucky, especially in the more remote parts of Leslie County, life went on as usual, not caring about the big events. People lived in communities that were spread out over deep valleys and steep slopes. In the morning, the mist hung around, and the only sound was the wind whistling through the pines and the icy streams. Families in that area had known each other for a long time. Everyone knew who lived where and what land they farmed. It was normal to not trust people you didn't know. The roads were dangerous. They were often just muddy paths that wound up the mountain. It took determination to get there, and not many people went there without a good reason. People kept to themselves there. County law didn't come around very often, and secrets could grow in the shadows of the old trees. Rosie Hale made her home in this area. She came from a bigger city to the south, and her neighbors were curious about her because she seemed mysterious. Rosie lived alone in a dark wooden cabin that was almost 2 kilometers from the main road. She stayed away from the other families. She didn't go to community meetings or the small church that served as a place to meet. When she needed supplies, she would go to the nearest store, buy what she needed, and come back before anyone could talk to her. The people who lived there guessed. Some people said she had run away from a bad marriage, while others whispered that she was hiding something worse that had made her go to the mountains for safety. But no one was sure. Rosie didn't give any reasons, and her always serious face made people not want to ask questions. Her dark eyes looked like they were carrying an invisible weight, and there was a sadness in them that made people not want to come near. The cabin she lived in was basic but clean. Even on the hottest days, smoke always came out of the chimney, as if she needed to keep something warm all the time. At night, a faint light flickered in the windows, and sometimes muffled sounds echoed through the valley. People walking by on the nearby trail said they heard whispers, as if Rosie were talking to someone. But she lived alone. At least, that's what everyone thought. Rosie's presence became a part of the landscape over time. People got used to her being alone. After all, everyone in the mountains had the right to be alone. But then things started to change. Small things that didn't mean anything on their own started to come together to make a disturbing pattern. The first signs were very small, almost unnoticeable. Thomas Brennan, the owner of the local store, started to notice that Rosie was shopping in a strange way. She always bought the same basic things, like flour, salt, canned goods, and kerosene for the lamps. But her shopping habits changed in the fall of that year. She started buying a lot more food, always 2 or 3 times as much as usual. Thomas asked her if she was expecting visitors in a casual way. Rosie just shook her head and left without saying a word. It was even more interesting that she started buying remedies, not the usual ones for colds or aches and pains, but special tonics, things to put on wounds, and thick bandages. When the salesman told her to see the traveling doctor who came to the area once a month, Rosie coldly said she could handle her own problems. The firmness of her voice made the conversation end. The noises coming from the cabin, on the other hand, got more frequent and scary. Martha Coleman, who lived about a mile away on the closest property, started telling her neighbors that she heard strange things at night. The sounds weren't just whispers. They sounded like muffled moans, as if someone was in pain but couldn't scream. Martha asked her husband to look into it, but he said no. He said it wasn't their place to tell Rosie what to do on her own land. The mountain landscape changed as the seasons changed. The winter of 1917 came in a harsh way, with blizzards that made the already small communities even more isolated. For weeks, the trails were impossible to use. No one saw Rosie during this time. The smoke coming from her chimney showed that she was still alive, but she didn't go down to get food even once during that long, cold winter. When spring finally came and the snow melted, Rosie came back to the store, but she was different. Her face, which was always thin, looked even more empty. There were dark, deep circles around her eyes, and her hands shook a little as she counted out the coins to pay. Thomas Brennan wanted to know how she had done over the winter. Rosie just nodded and said something about having been sick but getting better. But the purchases got big again, and there was something new. She started buying a lot of lime. He noticed this detail because lime was usually used to treat soil or for sanitary reasons. Thomas wanted to know, but he didn't want to ask. Rosie Hale had an unspoken line that no one crossed. That was when an event broke the first crack in the wall of silence. Samuel Pritchard, a hunter, was following a wounded deer up the hills when he accidentally got too close to Rosie's property. He was following the blood trail of the animal when he noticed that he was only a few hundred meters from the cabin. The sun was already starting to set, making the sky orange and red. Samuel thought it was time to turn back, but before he turned around, something caught his eye. There was a small wooden shed behind the cabin that he had never seen before. It was in an area that was partly hidden by thick trees. The door was open and swaying in the wind. Samuel didn't like to pry, but his curiosity got the better of him. He walked up slowly, trying not to make any noise. What he saw through the crack in the door made him feel very scared. There were makeshift shelves inside the shed, and on those shelves were glass bottles with dark liquids in them. There were also tools hanging on the walls, some of which had stains on them that Samuel didn't want to talk about. And on the floor, partially hidden by a dirty cloth, there was something that looked like... He couldn't finish what he was thinking. He quickly backed away, his heart racing, and left the place as quickly as he could without running. Samuel told his wife what he had seen when he got home, but he made her promise not to tell anyone. He wasn't sure what he had seen, and he didn't want to tell people things that might not be true. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it would start to grow in ways that no one expected. The next few weeks were even stranger. People started to see Rosie walking the trails at dusk, always alone and with heavy bags. She would look away and walk faster when she saw someone. She looked like she was carrying a heavy load, not just physically, but something deeper and darker. When her name came up, neighbors started to look at each other in a meaningful way, but no one did anything. She hadn't done anything illegal that they could prove, and in the mountains of Kentucky, privacy was very important, even when it meant getting involved in strange cases. The mountains were unbearably hot in the summer. The air was thick and wet, and even the wind that usually cooled the valleys seemed to have stopped. Martha Coleman made the decision to act at this point. The noises coming from Rosie's property at night had gotten louder, and Martha could no longer sleep well. They weren't just muffled moans anymore. They were rhythmic thumps, like something heavy was being pulled across the wooden floor. Martha got 2 other women from the community to go with her on a surprise visit. They used a freshly baked apple pie as an excuse, which is a common thing to do in that area. It wasn't a very good excuse, but it would have to do. The 3 women climbed the trail one August morning, before the sun was at its highest point. The path was steep, so we had to stop often. When they finally saw the cabin, they saw that the front door was closed, but the curtains in the windows were moving. Martha knocked on the door. No noise. She knocked again, this time harder. They heard footsteps on the other side that were slow and unsure. Rosie finally came through the small opening in the door. Her face was even whiter, almost see-through, and there were dark circles under her eyes that made it look like she hadn't slept in a long time. She didn't say anything. She just looked at the visitors with a look that was a mix of shock and something like fear. Martha smiled and handed over the pie. Rosie thought about it for a moment, but then said yes. The women thought they would be let in, as was usual, but Rosie stayed in the doorway, blocking their view of the inside. Martha tried to talk to Rosie about the weather and the harvests, but Rosie only answered with one word. There was a strong sense of tension in the air, and it grew worse with each passing second. At that point, Elizabeth Murray, one of the women, saw something strange. She was able to see part of the cabin's interior through the crack in the door. She was disturbed by what she saw. There were dark stains on the wooden floor that looked like they had been rubbed many times but still left marks. There were things hanging on the walls that she couldn't quite put her finger on, but they didn't seem to belong in a normal home. Rosie saw that Elizabeth was looking at her with curiosity and stepped back, almost closing the door. She thanked her for the pie with a shaky voice and said she was busy and had to get back to work. They heard the lock click into place on the other side of the door before Martha could say anything. The three women stood there for a few moments, looking at each other in confusion. What had just happened proved that something was very wrong. Elizabeth couldn't stop talking about what she saw on the way back. She talked about the stains on the floor and the weird things on the walls. Martha said that Rosie looked scared, as if she were hiding something bad. Sarah Bennett, the third woman, said that maybe they should tell the county sheriff, but Martha wasn't sure. The sheriff lived more than 30 kilometers away, and making a report without proof could cause problems. Also, Rosie hadn't really done anything wrong that they could point to. It was all based on feelings and suspicions. But suspicions grew stronger when a smell started to spread through the area a few days later. It didn't happen all the time, just on the hottest afternoons when the wind was blowing the right way. It smelled sweet and sickening, like something that was rotting. At first, the neighbors thought an animal had died nearby, which is common in forests. But the smell stayed and seemed to come from Rosie's property. The owner of the store, Thomas Brennan, talked to some men from the community in private. He mentioned Rosie's unusual purchases, especially the large quantities of lime. People knew that lime could get rid of smells and speed up the breakdown of things. It was used in graveyards and in situations where hygiene was very important. Why would a woman need so much lime by herself? The question was in the air, but no one answered it. Samuel Pritchard, the hunter who had seen the shed months before, finally decided to tell what he had seen. He talked about the jars, the dirty tools, and the thing on the floor that was covered. There was a lot of silence after he spoke. The men looked at each other, each thinking about what the other was saying. No one wanted to believe it, but the proof was hard to ignore. It was agreed that someone needed to look into it more, but who and with what power? The sheriff couldn't get involved without good proof, and no one wanted to talk to Rosie directly after the way she acted when the women came to see her. There was also fear of what they might find out, and fear that their worst fears would come true. Rosie went about her daily life alone, but now everyone was watching her while the community talked about it in silence. People noticed everything she did and talked about every trip she made to the store. She was at the center of an invisible web of spying, and she seemed to know it. Every day, her shoulders got more and more hunched, as if the stairs were heavy. And on nights when the moon wasn't out, the sounds coming from her cabin echoed through the valley like scary reminders that something terrible was happening, something that no one was brave enough to face yet. In the fall of 1917, the colors of the mountains changed. The trees were dressed in gold and red, and the temperature started to drop slowly. A stranger came to the area at this time. Daniel Whitmore said he was a representative of a lumber company and wanted to look at the local forests to see if they could be used for business. He stayed at the only guest house that was open, which was a small house run by the widow Eleanina Price. Daniel was a middle-aged man who dressed well by local standards and was polite but reserved. He always heard people talking about Rosie Hale in hushed tones while he walked along the trails and wrote notes in a black notebook. At first, he didn't care much and was more interested in his work. But as the days went by and he heard more details, he became more interested. That night, Daniel sat by the fire in the boarding house's common room with Thomas Brennan. The talk started out casually about the weather and the harvest, but Thomas, who may have been affected by the drink that warmed his hands, started talking about Rosie. He talked about the strange things he bought, how alone he felt, and the rumors that were going around. Daniel paid close attention and asked questions that showed he was really interested. Thomas didn't know that Daniel Whitmore wasn't really who he said he was. He worked as a land appraiser, but he used to be a private investigator in Louisville. After a case that ended badly, he quit that job, but his instincts never fully left him. Something about the stories about Rosie Hale brought back that old investigative fire in him. Daniel started asking more specific questions in the days that followed. He talked to Martha Coleman, who told him about the strange visit to the cabin. He spoke with Samuel Pritchard, who didn't want to talk about what he had seen in the shed. Daniel was putting together a puzzle in his mind, and each conversation added a piece to it. The more pieces that fit together, the darker the picture became. Daniel made up his mind that he had to see for himself. On a cloudy afternoon, he took his backpack and went on a hike that he told Mrs. Price would take him to the northern edge of the area to look at a certain wooded area. But he really wanted to go to Rosie Hale's house. He planned his route so that it would go close to the cabin, staying in the woods where he could see without being seen. He got there in the late afternoon, when the shadows were starting to get longer between the trees. He stood behind a thick group of pine trees that gave him a partial view of the cabin and shed that Samuel had talked about. After that, he waited. The only sounds in the forest were the distant songs of a few night birds and the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. As always in the mountains, night fell quickly. A dim light came through the cabin window, probably from an oil lamp. Daniel stayed still in his place, staring at the building. Nothing interesting happened for hours. Around midnight, the cabin door opened, and he started to wonder if he had wasted his time. Rosie came out with something heavy wrapped in a dark cloth. She had a hard time moving and had to stop a lot to change the weight in her arms. Daniel's heart started to race. She walked toward the shed and went inside. The light from the lamp she was carrying made strange shadows on the wooden planks. Daniel could hear sounds that were muffled, movements, and something being dragged. He looked for more than an hour. Rosie came out of the shed with nothing in her hands. Her hands looked dirty, and she rubbed them on her skirt over and over again as she walked back into the cabin. The door shut, the light from the window went out, and the night was quiet again. Daniel knew he had seen something important, but he wasn't sure what it was. His doubts grew, but doubts weren't proof. He wanted more. He made up his mind to look more closely at the shed the next morning, right after Rosie left the house to go shopping. It was dangerous, maybe even against the law, but he couldn't ignore what might be going on there. He couldn't sleep well at the inn for the rest of the night because he kept thinking about what he would do. He got back into position near dawn, this time with a clear plan. Around 8 o'clock in the morning, he saw Rosie leave the cabin and follow the path to the store. He knew he had at least 2 hours before she came back. He had enough time if he was careful. He walked toward the shed with his heart racing. The door was locked with a simple bolt. He took a deep breath, looked around to make sure no one was there, and opened it. What he found inside would change everything. It would not only change how he thought about the case, but also the future of that whole small community in the Kentucky mountains. The shed held secrets that no one was prepared to face, secrets that would challenge even the most experienced investigators. Daniel stood still at the entrance of the warehouse for long seconds, his eyes adjusting to the dim light inside. The smell that hit him was intense, a mixture of chemicals, damp earth, and something organic that he couldn't quite identify. There were the shelves Samuel had talked about, and they were full of bottles of all sizes. Some contained clear liquids, others dark and viscous. Some of them had handwritten labels on them, but it was hard to read the writing in the low light. Tools hung on the wall in the other corner, making for a creepy collection. There were saws of different sizes, long knives, and tools that looked like they were for medical or surgical use. Daniel wasn't an expert in these fields, but he did know that some things shouldn't be in the hands of an everyday person. There was a pile of stained fabrics next to the tools that were folded in a strange way, as if they had been used and reused many times. But what really caught his eye was the thing in the middle of the shed. There was a lot of space taken up by a sturdy wooden table that had gotten darker over time and use. There were a lot of scratches and deep carvings on its surface. There were stains that seemed permanent, absorbed by the wood itself. There were metal buckets and more fabric stacked up under the table. Daniel approached cautiously, trying to understand the purpose of that arrangement. That's when he noticed something in the corners of the shed. There were marks on the dirt floor, as if something heavy had been repeatedly dragged from the center towards the back of the building. He followed the marks with his eyes and realized they led to an area covered by loose planks. His investigative instinct screamed that he should lift those planks, but a part of him hesitated. There was a line between curiosity and trespassing that he knew he was about to cross. He checked his pocket watch. He still had time. With trembling hands, he began to carefully remove the boards, trying not to make a sound. The wood was damp and heavy. When he finally removed the main pieces, an opening in the floor was revealed. A kind of makeshift cellar dug into the earth. The darkness down there was absolute. Daniel lit a match, its weak light flickering. What the flame illuminated made him instinctively recoil. There were structures descending into that subterranean space, like a small rough wooden staircase. And down there, partially visible in the flickering light, he saw shapes wrapped in fabric, arranged in an organized manner. He couldn't see the details, but the meaning was too clear to miss. The match burned his fingers, so he dropped it and went back into the dark. Daniel needed a few minutes to calm down. He was getting confirmation of his worst fears, but he needed more solid proof before he could make any decisions. He carefully put the boards back where they belonged, trying to keep everything the same. He looked around the shed again, taking in every last detail. Then he went outside without saying a word and closed the door, making sure the bolt was in the same place it had always been. He quickly left the property, his heart still racing. He had to think. He had to make a choice about what to do with what he had found. It would be impossible to go back to the boarding house and act like nothing happened, but it would be dangerous and foolish to face Rosie alone. The most sensible option would be to seek out the sheriff, but that would take time, and he wasn't sure the authorities would take his suspicions seriously without more substantial evidence. He spent the rest of the day wandering the trails, trying to organize his thoughts. Elenina Price said that Elenina Price looked worried when he got back to the inn at night. Daniel said he had gotten lost on the trails and stayed longer than he had planned in the strong sun. She offered him tea and a hot meal, but he could barely eat. Daniel made up his mind that night while lying in his narrow bed. He would go to town and find the sheriff himself. He would tell the authorities everything he had learned, including what the residents had said and what he had seen himself, even if it took days to convince them. It was the right thing to do. He couldn't just leave and forget about it. His conscience wouldn't let him. But fate had other ideas. The next morning, before Daniel could leave, There was a lot of noise in the small town. Martha Coleman came into the store very upset and quickly talked about something that had happened during the night. Rosie Hale had come down from her cabin before dawn and was banging on Martha's door in clear desperation. Rosie had asked for help for the first time since she got to those mountains. Daniel went to the store with the other residents to hear Martha's story. She said Rosie was in a terrible state, with ripped and dirty clothes, messy hair, and red eyes from crying. She said she couldn't take the pressure any longer and had to confess that she had done things that would never be forgiven. Martha was scared but kind and had tried to calm Rosie down, but the woman was almost incoherent, switching between sobs and mumbling that made no sense. Thomas Brennan said that someone should go to the cabin to see if everything was okay. Daniel quickly offered to help, along with Samuel Pritchard and 2 other men from the community. They climbed the trail in a tense silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what they might find. The morning sun lit up the mountains with a golden light that was very different from the darkness of what they were about to find. The walk to the cabin felt like it would never end, even though it only took 20 minutes. Daniel led the group in a single line because he had seen the path better than the others over the last few days. Samuel was right behind him with his rifle. He didn't plan to use it, but in the mountains, it was always a good idea to be ready for anything. Jacob Foster and William Hayes, the other 2 men, walked silently, stealing nervous glances at each other. The place looked different in the morning when the cabin finally came into view among the trees. The air was eerily quiet, as if even the birds were staying away. The front door was open a little bit and swayed in the morning breeze. Daniel told the others to stop and walked up to Rosie, calling her name. No response. He slowly opened the door, and the creaking of the hinges sounded scary. The inside of the cabin was surprisingly clean. The furniture was simple but well kept. The kitchen was small with clean utensils hanging on the wall, and the bed was neatly made in one corner. But there were also things that were scary. The stains on the floor that Elizabeth had talked about were bigger than they first looked through the crack in the door. They had been scrubbed hard, but the wood had absorbed some of the stuff, leaving dark, permanent shadows. There were hand-drawn diagrams on the walls, hanging from hooks. Daniel came closer to take a better look at them. They were anatomical diagrams that were surprisingly detailed and accurate. They showed the body's internal structures, organ systems, proportions, and measurements written in the margins. The writing was the same as the writing on the labels on the jars in the shed. It was soft, but strong. There were also pages ripped out of medical books and nailed to the wall. Some of them were so old that the paper was yellowed and brittle. Samuel went into the cabin after Daniel, and the others followed. Everyone stood still and watched, trying to figure out what they saw. Jacob pulled a wooden box out from under the bed and took it outside. There were dozens of notebooks inside, all full of very detailed notes. Daniel picked one at random and started to read it. The pages had records that were dated, clinical observations, and descriptions of procedures. The words were technical, almost scientific, but the situation made it seem very disturbing. One entry from March of that year caught his eye. It went into great detail about a preservation process that used certain chemicals. It talked about the best temperatures, how long to expose something, and what results to expect. Daniel felt a chill run down his back. This wasn't the work of an average person. There was knowledge, training, and a method that implied prior experience. William, who had stayed close to the door, called the others. He had discovered something behind a curtain that separated a small room from the rest of the cabin. There was a table with papers, stacked books, and more bottles of different liquids on it. It was like a temporary office, but the picture in the frame on the table really caught his eye. It showed Rosie a lot younger, in formal clothes, standing next to a man with gray hair who was wearing a white lab coat. There was a sign on the wall behind them that looked like it was for a hospital or something similar, even though it was blurry in the picture. Daniel looked at the picture more closely. There was a faded ink inscription at the bottom. He could only partially read the words, but he could make out what looked like a name and the year 1898. This meant that the picture was close to 20 years old. The picture showed Rosie looking like she was in her 20s, so she would be in her 40s now. But who was the man next to her, and what kind of place was it? The guys thought it was time to look in the shed. If their suspicions were right, that's where they would find the most convincing proof. They walked the 50 meters from the cabin to the smaller building. When Samuel opened the bolt, Daniel's stomach turned. The inside was easier to see this time because the sun was shining through the cracks in the boards. The shelves with jars, the hanging tools, and the marked table were all just like he remembered them. But now, with 4 pairs of eyes looking at every detail, new things were found. There was a basic ventilation system in the ceiling made up of metal pipes that went outside, probably to get rid of smells. In some places, the walls had been covered with lime, which was clearly meant to stop the growth of bacteria and fungi. Jacob walked up to the shelves and started to read the labels on the bottles. Some of them had names of chemicals that he had heard of from talking to the traveling doctor, like formaldehyde, ethyl alcohol, and saline solutions. He didn't know some of them at all. There were also containers that looked like they held preserved specimens, but the cloudy glass and murky liquid made it hard to tell what was inside. Daniel knew it was time to tell everyone what he had found on the ground. He pointed to the loose boards and quickly told them that there was a space below them. The other 3 men looked at each other and the tension was clear. Everyone knew they had to look, but no one wanted to be the first. Samuel, who was the oldest and most experienced person in the group, took on the job. They took the boards off again, but this time it was easier because Daniel had already loosened them the day before. The hole turned out to be bigger than it first looked. The rough ladder went down about 2 meters to the bottom. Samuel picked up a lamp that was hanging on the wall and carefully climbed down. His friends watched from above with bated breath. The light from the lamp slowly lit up the underground area. They had thought it would be smaller, but it was bigger. They carefully dug it out to make a room about 3 square meters. Planks had been added to the earthen walls to keep them from falling down. Samuel had to bend down because the ceiling was so low. But what really mattered was on the walls. There were wooden structures built at different heights that looked like shelves or bunk beds. On top of these structures were shapes wrapped in cloth and tied with ropes. Samuel counted them in his head, 6 in all, with different sizes and shapes. Some of them looked like they had been there longer than others. There was a strong smell of chemicals, even with the ventilation, but there was also a smell of decay that the chemicals couldn't completely hide. Samuel didn't touch anything. He just watched, remembered, and then climbed back up. His face was pale and serious. When he came out of the hole, the others bombarded him with questions, but he just shook his head. He told them to call the police right away because this was way too much for them to handle on their own. There was proof of actions that only trained investigators and police should look into. Daniel completely agreed. He said that 2 of them should stay on the property to make sure nothing changed, while the other 2 should go to town to get the sheriff. The sun was already high, and if they left right away, they could come back with the police the next day. Samuel and William offered to go because they were the best horsemen in the group and knew the best ways to get through the mountains. Daniel and Jacob were told to set up a secret camp nearby so they could keep an eye on things without being seen if Rosie came back. But everyone was wondering the same thing. Where was Rosie? Martha said she had left after her broken confession, and she'd gone down the trail before anyone could stop her. Was she trying to get away, or did she have something else in mind? The afternoon dragged on. Daniel and Jacob took turns watching over the camp, with one always awake and the other sleeping. The shed and the cabin were still and empty. There was no movement and no sign of life. It looked like the place had been empty for years, but Rosie had been there the night before, doing her shady business in the dark. As the sun set and the sky turned orange and purple, Daniel thought about everything they had learned. The evidence pointed to something that was planned, carried out with a technical skill, and done in a systematic way. Rosie wasn't an impulsive or reckless killer. She knew exactly what she was doing. She had turned that remote cabin in the mountains into a place for purposes that were beyond understanding. And the questions kept coming. Who were the people in the basement that were still alive? Where did they come from? How had Rosie gotten them to come to that faraway place? And most importantly, why? What was the end goal of all this? The night came to the Kentucky mountains, bringing with it the autumn chill and a sky full of stars that stood out sharply from the darkness of the day's discoveries. Daniel and Jacob stayed awake because they knew the next few hours would be very important. Rosie Hale was free somewhere in those endless mountains, and she held the secrets that could explain the terrible things they had left behind. Daniel had never had a night in the mountains like this one before. It wasn't really quiet. It was a symphony of soft sounds that got louder in the dark. The rustling of dry leaves, the distant howl of coyotes, and the occasional crackling of dry branches. Every sound made his heart race because he thought it might be Rosie coming back to her house. But the hours went by and nothing happened. The cabin stayed dark and quiet, a darker shadow against the night sky. Jacob slept against a tree while Daniel kept watch. His mind kept going back to the picture they had found in the cabin. The man in the lab coat, the medical institution in the background, and Rosie, who looked young and respectable. There was a story there, a past that would surely explain at least some of who she had become. Daniel wanted to bring the picture with him, but they agreed not to take anything from the scene so that the official investigation could look at everything as it was. Daniel woke Jacob up as the first light of dawn began to brighten the horizon and turn the dark sky blue. They had to make plans for what to do the next day. It wasn't possible to stay there forever. They had only brought water and a few biscuits, which would last them a day or two if they rationed. But at best, Samuel and William wouldn't be back with the sheriff until nightfall. Jacob was the one who told them to go to the store to get food and tell the other residents what was going on. They could come back later to make sure the community knew what was going on. Daniel hesitated at first because he was worried about leaving the property unguarded, but he saw that the idea was smart. They also wanted to see if there was any news about Rosie and if anyone had seen her. As the sun rose, it lit up the valleys and hills with that golden light that is so typical of autumn mornings. It was still cold, and their breaths made little clouds of vapor. They got to the store at about 7 o'clock in the morning and saw Thomas Brennan already opening it. He was surprised to see them at first, but when he saw the seriousness on their faces, he quickly changed his mind. Daniel and Jacob told each other everything they had found while they were inside the store, where they were warming their hands with hot coffee. Thomas listened without saying anything, and his face got paler as the details came out. He stayed quiet for a long time after they were done, thinking about what they had said. He finally said in a low voice that he had always known there was something very wrong with Rosie, but he had never thought it was this bad. Martha Coleman came soon after, and then Elizabeth Murray and other women from the area came. The news was already getting around, and everyone wanted to know more. Daniel told the story again, this time leaving out some of the more disturbing parts to protect the feelings of those who were there. But the main point was clear. Rosie Hale had turned her remote home into a place for activities that no one could fully understand, but that definitely involved terrible things. Martha said that Rosie hadn't come back home since she left the day before. No one had seen her on any of the main trails. It was as if she had just disappeared into the mountain's vastness. Some people thought she might have gone to the valley on the other side of the mountain range, where there was a road that went to bigger towns. Some people thought she might have hidden in one of the area's many natural caves. Daniel understood something important at that moment. If Rosie had really run away, she had only taken the clothes on her back. She had left behind all of her things, including her carefully filled notebooks and all the proof of what she had done. This didn't make sense for someone who was planning to get away for good. Someone as organized and methodical as she is would have planned an escape route, gotten rid of evidence, and taken important papers. Unless her desperate confession to Martha was a real emotional breakdown and not part of a plan. Thomas brought up a possibility that no one wanted to think about. What if Rosie hadn't run away but instead went to a quiet place to end her own story? There were many cliffs, deep rivers, and other places in the mountains where someone could disappear without a trace. Martha objected, saying that no matter what, Rosie should have the chance to explain what she did and face the law. But the thought of that possibility hung over the conversation. As the morning went on, more and more people came to the store, turning it into a kind of temporary command center. Someone said that search parties should be set up to look for Rosie, but Daniel disagreed. He said it was unsafe for civilians to search the mountains for someone who might be desperate and unpredictable. It was better to wait for the police, who would come ready and trained to deal with the problem. Then, out of nowhere, some new information came in. A man named Herbert Lewis, who lived far away to the southeast, came by and said he had seen something strange the night before. He was up around midnight taking care of a sick cow when he heard someone walking quickly along the path that went by his land. He lit a lamp and went outside to look around. He got there just in time to see a woman figure disappearing into the dark, moving quickly toward the mountain's more remote areas. Herbert couldn't see her face, but her height and how she walked were the same as what he knew about Rosie. She was going in a direction that didn't lead to any known property, only to wild areas where few people went. There were some old buildings in that area that had been left behind, like hunters' cabins and a sawmill that hadn't been used in decades. Rosie might have known some of these places and was hiding there. Daniel and Jacob thought it was time to go back to the observation post close to Rosie's house. They thought the sheriff would come that afternoon, so they had to be there to show him the way and give him all the information they had gathered. But before they left, Daniel asked Thomas to tell him everything he could remember about the things Rosie had bought in the last few years. Thomas liked to keep simple records, and even though they weren't very detailed, they might give us some clues about when she did things. The records showed an interesting pattern. Rosie's shopping habits had changed a lot about 1.5 years ago, at the start of 1916. Before that, she only bought the basics, which is what a person living alone would normally buy. But after that date, the amounts grew a lot, and strange things started to show up on the lists: chemicals, big amounts of fabric, and specialized tools. Something had changed during that time that made her start or do more of her shady things. Daniel took note of this in his mind. 18 months. This meant that there could have been evidence from that time up to now. If the shapes in the basement were what he thought they were, then a lot of people had either gone missing or come to Rosie's property during that time. But who were these people? People who travel? Wanderers? There weren't many strangers in the area, so people would have noticed and talked about disappearances. This thought led to another troubling question. What if the people in question weren't from the area? What if Rosie had a way to get people from outside to come to her? People whose absence wouldn't be noticed or looked into right away. People without strong ties like traveling salesmen, seasonal workers, and fugitives looking for a place to hide would sometimes use the roads that cut through the mountains. These were people who could disappear without making a big deal out of it. The sun was already high in the sky when Daniel and Jacob finally got back to their observation point. The property stayed empty and quiet. They settled down again among the trees, this time with extra supplies that Thomas had insisted on bringing. The wait started over again, but this time with a new sense of purpose. In a few hours, the police would show up, and the official investigation would start. Daniel took the time to think about everything they knew: the old photo that hinted at Rosie's medical or scientific connection, the detailed notebooks with technical language, the shed that was set up like a lab or procedure room, the basement that held preserved evidence, and the frantic escape after a broken confession. Each piece on its own was disturbing, but when you put them all together, they painted a picture that hinted at something more than just crime. There was a reason for it, a way to do it, and maybe even a twisted reason that only Rosie could understand. The weather changed in the afternoon. The wind picked up, and dark clouds started to gather over the mountaintops. A storm was coming, which was normal for that time of year, but always amazing at high altitudes. Daniel was worried about Samuel and William, and hoped they would be able to get back before the rains made the trails too dangerous. Daniel heard noises coming from the main path at that point, when the sun started to be blocked by clouds and the first drops of rain fell. He didn't hear the sound of galloping horses. Instead, he heard slow, dragging footsteps. He told Jacob to be quiet, and then they both moved to get a better look at who was coming. The shape that came out of the bend in the trail made Daniel's heart stop for a second. Rosie Hale was there. She was back. She had mud and leaves all over her clothes, which were dirty and torn. Normally, her hair was pulled back into a tight bun, but now it was loose and messy over her shoulders. But what stood out the most was her face. There was no fear or despair, just a deep sense of resignation, as if she had made a final choice and was okay with what would happen next. Rosie walked straight to the cabin without looking to either side, as if she didn't notice the rain that was starting to fall harder. She walked inside and shut the door behind her. A little while later, the windows lit up. She was inside, waiting. But what are you waiting for? For the sheriff who was coming to get her? For some reason that only she knew? Daniel and Jacob looked at each other, not sure what to do. Should they face her? Should they just keep waiting? They made the choice when they finally heard horses less than an hour later. Samuel and William were coming back, and they weren't by themselves. 3 men rode along with them on strong horses and wore raincoats. The sheriff of Leslie County had come, along with 2 of his deputies. The real investigation was about to start, and maybe it would finally solve the dark mysteries that had haunted those mountains for so long. Sheriff Harold Mason was about 50 years old, of average height, and had a thick mustache. His piercing gaze showed that he had dealt with a wide range of situations in the Kentucky mountains for decades. His 2 younger deputies had rifles and looked ready for anything. They got off their horses close to where Daniel and Jacob were waiting for them, and Samuel quickly introduced them as the rain got heavier. Daniel told the sheriff everything, from the community's first suspicions to what they found in the cabin and the shed. Mason didn't say anything while he listened, and his face didn't change, but his eyes showed how seriously he took in every detail. When Daniel said that Rosie had come back and was now inside the cabin, the sheriff nodded slowly and started to tell his men what to do. The plan would be careful, but strong. Mason was clear that he didn't want any extra violence, but he also didn't want to take any chances. One of the deputies stood on the side of the cabin where he could see the back door in case Rosie tried to get out that way. The other one stayed near the front door with a rifle in hand but pointed down. The sheriff then walked over to the door and knocked 3 times, making sure it was loud. It was so quiet that it felt like it would never end. The rain hitting the roof of the cabin and the leaves of the trees made a constant noise that made it hard to hear anything going on inside. Mason knocked again, this time to let everyone know he was there and in charge. His voice was strong, accustomed to being obeyed, but there was also a note of professional respect, like someone who understood the gravity of the situation. The door opened slowly. Rosie appeared in the doorway, illuminated by the dim light of the lamp behind her. Her face was calm, almost serene, an expression that contrasted dramatically with the state of her clothes and hair. She looked at the sheriff, then at the men positioned around her, and finally spoke. Her voice was low but clear, without a trace of hysteria or fear. She said she knew why they were there, that she had been waiting for them, and that she was ready to accompany them. Mason asked if he could go into the cabin and look around. Rosie moved away from the door as a sign that she agreed. The sheriff walked in carefully, followed by Daniel, who he had asked to come along as a civilian witness. The deputies stayed outside with Rosie, keeping a respectful but watchful distance. Mason carefully looked at every corner of the cabin. He looked at the stains on the floor, the diagrams on the walls, and the notebooks that were stacked up. He flipped through some of them, and as he read the detailed notes, his face grew darker and darker. He asked Daniel to show him the shed, and they both walked there in the pouring rain. The sheriff, who had seen a lot of things before, had a clear reaction to what was inside the shed. He stood there for a long time, just watching, with his jaw clenched. He looked at the marked table, the jars, and the tools. Mason nodded seriously when Daniel pointed to the loose boards on the floor. He then went down into the underground space with a lamp. He stayed down there for almost 10 minutes, which was long enough to look at the evidence closely without moving it. His face was pale when he came out, even though he had been through a lot. He told Daniel that he would need to hire more men because this was too big for his small team to handle. He said he would send a message to the state capitol asking for specialized investigators. This wasn't a normal crime case in the country. It was too complicated for him to handle on his own. They went back to the cabin, where Rosie was sitting in a chair with the deputies on either side of her. The rain had stopped, but it was still a steady drizzle. Mason sat across from her at the table, took a notebook out of his coat pocket, and got ready to ask questions. But Rosie raised her hand to ask for silence before he could start. She said she needed to tell her story and that she wanted to do it her way, without anyone interrupting her. Mason thought about it for a minute and then said yes. Letting a suspect talk freely sometimes gave more information than structured questioning. Rosie took a deep breath and stared at something far away, as if she were looking at a place that was lost in the past. Then she started to talk, and in the stillness of the mountain cabin, her voice became almost hypnotic. She said that she was born in Baltimore, Maryland, to a well-respected doctor who worked at a university hospital. She was interested in medicine from a young age, but her father, who was ahead of his time, arranged for her to work as an assistant in his lab because women weren't often accepted into medical schools at the time. Rosie became very interested in anatomy and preserving tissues while she was there. Her father got her a job at a private medical research school when she was 22 years old in 1898. Rosie worked there for almost 10 years, learning advanced preservation techniques, studying how the body is put together, and helping with research that would save lives. She loved her job, and it gave her life meaning. But then something happened, something she didn't go into detail about, that had to do with research that crossed moral lines. In 1908, the government suddenly shut down the institution. Some of the researchers were taken into custody, while others just vanished. Even though Rosie wasn't directly involved, her reputation was ruined because of it. Neither a hospital nor a university would take her. Her father was embarrassed and stopped talking to her. She was alone with knowledge and skills that she could no longer use. For years, she moved from town to town, doing odd jobs to make ends meet and always hiding her past. But she never stopped wanting to use what she knew and keep doing the work she thought was her calling. In 1915, she finally made it to the mountains of Kentucky, where she could be alone and rebuild something like her old lab, a place where she could study without being judged. As Rosie got to the next part, her voice shook a little. She said that at first she only wanted to study animal specimens to keep getting better at preserving them. But loneliness, anger over lost years, and maybe something darker that she couldn't quite put her finger on, led her down a different path. She started to think about the things she had never been able to really look into, the studies that social and moral rules said she couldn't do. Rosie stopped seeing occasional travelers as people and started seeing them as chances when they came through the area. These were people who didn't have a set destination and no one to ask about them. She had chances to finish the work she had to stop doing, to prove to herself that what she knew was useful, even if that usefulness only existed in her own mind, which was clouded by bitterness and loneliness. At that point, Sheriff Mason cut in with a tense voice and asked how many people were involved. Rosie closed her eyes for a long time before saying, 6, over 18 months. Each one carefully written down in her notebooks, with the clinical accuracy she had learned decades before. She insisted that these were not acts of impulsive violence, but rather the continuation of scientific research, even though she knew that the world would never see it that way. Daniel felt sick when he heard Rosie talk about what she did in such a cold way. She only saw the victims as things to study, which was a big problem because they were people. The sheriff, who was very professional, asked who these people were. Rosie said she didn't know what their real names were. In most cases, they were drifters, temporary workers, or people she convinced to stay in her remote cabin during storms or cold nights. They were people who believed in the kindness of a lonely woman. Rosie talked about technical details for more than an hour, but she never talked about the exact times of the deaths. Even in her twisted story, it seemed like there was a line she wouldn't cross when she spoke. Mason was always writing things down, and his face showed that he was in control. When Rosie was done, the silence that followed was heavy, and the only sound was the rain that had started again outside. Finally, the sheriff spoke. His voice was heavy with the weight of the duty that had been placed on him. He told Rosie that she was being arrested on suspicion of killing more than one person, that she would be taken to the county jail, and that there would be a formal trial when the investigations were over. Rosie just nodded, as if she had known those words would come. It was as if her confession was something that had to happen, something she had always known would happen. In the days that followed, that peaceful part of the Kentucky mountains became a hub of activity like never before. Sheriff Mason kept his promise and sent messages to the capital asking for help from experts. In less than a week, state investigators, a medical examiner, and official documenters showed up. Ropes and warning signs blocked off Rosie's property, and teams carefully listed every item, note, and piece of evidence. During this time, Daniel stayed in the area to help out and be a witness when needed. He saw that the investigators were working very quickly, taking pictures of everything, numbering each vial, tool, and page of the notebooks. It was exactly how it needed to be, slow and careful. There couldn't be any mistakes in a case this big. The community reacted in many different ways when they found out everything that had happened in their area. Some people in the neighborhood felt bad for not doing something sooner and for not seeing the signs that were so clear in hindsight. Martha Coleman felt this burden the most, always saying that she should have pushed harder and gotten the police involved sooner. But some people remembered that in the mountains, it was a deeply ingrained tradition to respect other people's privacy, and no one could have known how far Rosie's actions would go. As a supplier of many of the materials Rosie had used, Thomas Brennan was in a tricky situation. He felt partly to blame, even though he hadn't done anything wrong in the eyes of the law. He stayed up all night going over each deal and conversation in his head, looking for clues he should have seen. Investigators talked to him a lot about the purchase records and used what he said to make a timeline of events. Rosie was kept in solitary confinement in the county jail, where she was always being watched. Sheriff Mason was worried that she might try to kill herself, which sometimes happens with prisoners who are facing serious charges. But Rosie looked strangely calm, even relieved. She fully cooperated with the investigators, answering technical questions about her notebooks and explaining procedures when asked. She stayed calm and collected, as if she were talking about real scientific experiments instead of horrible things. Detectives tried to figure out who the victims were, but it was hard because they were always moving around. They were able to figure out some of the victims' identities by looking at things that were found with the bodies in the basement. A traveling hardware salesman went missing in April 1916, and his family in Tennessee spent more than a year looking for him without success. A traveling sawmill worker who no one had reported missing because he didn't have any known family. A woman who was apparently on the run from a bad home situation and had no ties to a specific place. Each identification came with sad stories of lives cut short and missed opportunities. Daniel helped with some of these investigations by using his old skills as a private investigator to put the pieces together. It was hard work that took a toll on my emotions, but it had to be done. These people should have had their names restored. They should have been remembered as people, not just as victims without names. Newspapers from outside the area were also interested in the case. Reporters from bigger cities started to show up, looking for juicy details. Sheriff Mason showed wisdom by tightly controlling the flow of information, only giving out the most important details and doing everything he could to protect the victim's dignity. He wouldn't let anyone take pictures of the property or talk about specific things from Rosie's notebooks. The story was scary enough without any extra details. In the meantime, the small community tried to deal with what had happened and move on. People met at the local church to talk about their feelings and fears and try to make sense of what had happened. Reverend Clark, the pastor, was an older man who offered words of comfort and thought. He talked about how evil can show up in unexpected places, how important it is for communities to be watchful but also compassionate, and how important it is to forgive even when it seems impossible. Daniel was at a turning point in his life. He had finished his work appraising the land, so there was no reason to stay. But he had a connection to that place and those people that he hadn't felt in years. There was something about that community, the way they dealt with problems together, that moved him deeply. One night, the landlady, Elelena Price, said that he seemed to have found purpose again, which was clearly missing when he first got there. The trial was set for December 1917. It would take place in the county seat, in the courthouse, which didn't see many cases of this kind. Lawyers were hired for both sides, but everyone knew that Rosie's full confession made the verdict almost certain. The question would not be whether the person was guilty or not, but what the right sentence would be. Daniel went to see Rosie in jail in the days before the trial. He wasn't sure why he needed to do it. Maybe because he was looking for some understanding that he couldn't find. The small, high window in the cell let in dim afternoon light as they sat apart by bars. Rosie asked about the community, showing that she really wanted to know how people were reacting. Daniel answered truthfully, saying that he felt a mix of shock, sadness, and trying to understand. Rosie then asked him a question that surprised him. Did he think she was evil? Daniel didn't say anything for a long time because he was thinking about what to say. Lastly, he said that he didn't believe in absolute evil, but in choices that made people go down darker and darker paths. He said that she possessed knowledge and skill that could have served humanity, but that bitterness and isolation had led her to pervert those gifts into something terrible. Rosie listened expressionlessly, then nodded slowly as if agreeing with the assessment. The conversation shifted to Rosie's past, to the years she spent learning medicine in unconventional ways. She spoke nostalgically of that time when she believed she was contributing to something greater. The sadness in her voice was palpable as she described how everything had crumbled, how she had been expelled from the only world she knew. She didn't offer this as an excuse, but simply as context. Daniel listened, recognizing the complex humanity even in someone who had committed such inhumane acts. The sun was already setting when Daniel finally got out of prison, making the streets of the small town look very dark. He felt strangely melancholic, carrying the weight of knowledge he wasn't sure how to process. Rosie Hale was both a victim and a criminal. Her potential had been wasted by her own choices and the circumstances she found herself in. There were no easy answers, only the disturbing truth about how people really are. The trial was coming up, which would bring some kind of official end to the case. But Daniel knew that the real process of understanding and healing would take much longer for the community, the families of the victims who could be identified, and everyone else who had been affected by that dark story in the Kentucky mountains. Winter was coming, bringing snow that would blanket the trails and make the mountains even more isolated. But even in the winter, when everything is covered in snow, the secrets that were revealed would stay in people's minds as reminders that even in the most beautiful places, there can be deep shadows. The snow that falls in the mountains in the winter makes everything quiet. The trails were impossible for weeks, and the small community returned to its natural rhythm of seasonal isolation. Daniel decided to stay until spring, accepting occasional work and lodging at Elelina Price's boarding house, which had become almost a second home to him. That autumn's events changed something important in that area. People started talking to each other more and checking on each other more often. People used to accept being alone without question, but now they see it differently. People still respected privacy, but they were more aware that community was more than just living close to each other. While the legal process went on, Rosie's property stayed empty and was sealed off by the authorities. No one wanted to get close, and over time, plants started to take over the area. It looked like the trees were leaning over the cabin, as if nature was trying to hide it from view and slowly erase it from the landscape. Daniel thought about everything he had seen for many nights. He thought about how choices can change people's lives and how talents can be used for good or evil depending on the situation and the person's own choices. He also thought about how fragile life is and how it can end if you cross the wrong path at the wrong time. Martha Coleman set up monthly church meetings where people could talk, tell stories, and stay in touch with each other. They weren't always religious or formal meetings. They were just times to be together that reminded everyone they weren't alone in those big mountains. They realized that being alone could be bad for everyone, not just the people who chose it. Daniel finally got ready to leave when spring came. It was time for him to leave, and there were other places and stories waiting for him. A few people came to say goodbye to him on the morning of his departure. This is something that wouldn't have happened months ago when they were still tired strangers. Thomas Brennan gave him food for the trip. Samuel Pritchard made a detailed map of the best ways to get there, and Elelina Price just hugged him and cried. Daniel looked back one last time as he rode down the trail. The blue spring sky made the mountains look grand. Their slopes were covered in different shades of green where new plants were growing. The landscape was stunningly beautiful, but he knew he would always remember what those shadows hid. The stories that come from deep in the mountains often have a weight that words can't quite capture. These stories remind us how complicated people are, and how every choice has a thin line between light and dark. What happened in those far-off places is a reminder that even in the most remote places, where we think we are safe from the judgment of the world, our actions have effects that will eventually come to light. Years would go by, and that community would get stronger from the problems it had to deal with. The forest would eventually take back the cabin, leaving only a vague mark on the landscape. But the lessons would stay alive in the minds of everyone, passed down through the years as a warning about how dangerous it is to be completely alone and cut off from other people. And so, in the mountains of Kentucky, where the wind still whistles through the pines and the morning mist still rises from the valleys, the stories go on. They are stories that remind us to look out for each other, keep our connections strong, and never let darkness grow unnoticed in the shadows of being alone. If this trip through the dark secrets of the mountains moved you, you might want to subscribe to the channel for more stories about the hidden parts of history. And in the comments, tell us how your community stays close even when things are hard. Until the next story.